Tracy Tillman and Nick Alwine were lovingly snuggled against each other after another great love-making session. Nick had his arms around Tracy, and both were slightly sweaty from the previous exertion. Tracy pulled free and turned to face Nick. "You really need to buy a life insurance package from my husband," she said, looking him straight in the eye. "Another big deal will put him in the running for Salesman of the Year, and it's the least you could do for him." "I guess you're right about that," Nick said. "It's the least I can do for him." He grinned. "Have him meet me in my office in a couple of weeks. And now, since you just nudged me, I'm going to return the favor." They both cleaned themselves up a bit in the bathroom before leaving the hotel. They exchanged sweet kisses on the lips, after which Tracy went to her car and Nick to his, and they both drove to their respective homes. That's how they had lived for the past 6 months. They left work separately for a so-called client meeting and met at a different hotel each week, just to be discreet, as Nick put it. They were both confident that their spouses wouldn't guess anything, but they were a little worried that one of their coworkers might figure something out, so they switched meeting days from Tuesday through Thursday. Tracy got home at 5:20 p.m. and knew it would be about 10 minutes before her husband Brian arrived. That gave her time to change her clothes and spritz herself with perfume. Then she went downstairs and started dinner. Ever since the couple's only child had gone off to college in the fall, things had gotten a lot easier. She could cook less food, and at the end of the day, she didn't have to rely on anyone but herself and Brian. No more running to soccer or baseball games or listening to Eric discuss which girl he was going to ask out that week. Tracy admitted to herself that although she missed that time in her life, she liked the freedom of being an empty nester and some of the benefits that came with it. Nick was one of those advantages. Tracy was Nick's right-hand man at the technology company they both worked for. At 32, Nick was already a vice president with the swagger and confidence of a man on the rise. He had played soccer at SMU, earned a degree in computer engineering, and kept himself in outside linebacker, halfback shape, as he called it, by going to the gym regularly. He and his wife of 9 years had 2 young boys and a girl. Tracy had been promoted to Nick's receptionist about a year ago and was immediately charmed by his looks and intelligence. They started bantering with each other, but it soon escalated to little touches and double hints. Sex first happened after the couple had completed a successful project for a major client, and from the way they reacted to each other, they both knew it would become a regular occurrence. Tracy was 44 years old, but looked 34, with long blonde hair, firm breasts, and a firm ass. Her blue eyes sparkled when she was talking to someone she was interested in, and they definitely sparkled with Nick. Tracy loved her husband of 21 years and had never before even considered kissing another man. But Nick was different. He turned her on, made her feel young and attractive, not just someone's wife. Brian, in his 45 years, was still a good-looking man and kept himself in pretty good shape, but he was, well, Brian. As if on cue, Brian walked through the door, hung his keys on the hook by the door, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and kissed Tracy on the lips as he went upstairs to change. "Hey, Tracy," called out to him. "I made an appointment for you to see Nick next week about an executive insurance policy that should put you at the top of the list for top salesperson of the year." "Great. You're the best, baby," he echoed as he climbed the stairs. Brian was a good salesman, and since Tracy also worked, the couple made a good living. They lived in a nice house in a nice neighborhood, drove nice cars, and had good vacations. He and Tracy met one Sunday morning at the IHOP cafe and became friends, then dated, and then married a year later. Brian could be a bit conservative, but when Tracy wanted something, she usually got it. In the bedroom, too. She was a little more adventurous than Brian, but with patience. He became a good student and learned to do things that gave her pleasure. It was different with Nick, Tracy thought, as she prepared dinner. Nick wasn't as good in other ways, but being around him often made Tracy horny. Maybe it was his looks, maybe it was his body, or maybe it was the fact that the young hot guy desired her. Tracy was completely infatuated with Nick. It wasn't quite the same as with Brian. It was more than just sex. Both she and Nick knew that one day there would be a confession of sorts. 2 weeks later, Brian met Nick at his office and sold him a $1 million executive life plan, business life insurance. Brian explained to Nick that it was a favorable move for his family should something happen to Nick at the height of his career. Nick quickly signed the contract. Brian thought that Tracy had apparently already sold the policy to Nick, and Brian's arrival only made it official. It was a good commission, however, and Brian gave Tracy a thumbs up as he walked past her office with a signed contract. She smiled back. That evening, Brian didn't reach for a beer when he walked in the door. Instead, he pulled out a bottle of champagne and poured a glass each for himself and Tracy. "Unless I get struck by lightning, this year's Salesman of the Year will be mine," he said to Tracy as he handed her the champagne glass and then hugged her tightly. "You're my Salesman of the Year every year, baby," she replied. "Let me turn down the temperature of dinner, and you sell me your tongue as usual." Brian readily complied. Dinner and the remaining bottle of champagne were put on hold for an hour, while Tracy tried to turn Brian's face into a glazed donut. 5 days later, in the privacy of her hotel room, Tracy thanked Nick for making Brian so happy. She told Nick about the other sex that had happened that night and how Brian's happiness had helped her. "I'm so glad I was able to help you," Nick replied with mild disgust. "And did you see the stupid look on his face when he left my office? He looked like Phil Mickelson's ugly stepson." "Don't be cruel, dearie. That's very unkind of you," she teased back. "I'm sorry," he replied. "It's just that I spent a lot of money, and he gets a night of sex for it. There's something wrong with that picture. Actually, when he walked out of your office with that smirk on his face, I was thinking just the opposite. You got me the night before, and what he got was a stupid check. That's why I love you. You're so pragmatic," Nick said. "I thought you only loved me for my body and firm ass," she joked. "Well, that too, I guess," he added embarrassedly. About the same time, in another part of town, Brian was also wondering why Nick was buying insurance from him and why Tracy was even going through all this. Maybe the lovers were doing it as a humiliation to someone they thought was an ignorant cuckold, he thought to himself, and a slow smile spread across his face. Clueless indeed, he grinned to himself. As luck would have it, Brian had found out about the affair about 4 months ago. Although he had no way of knowing exactly when it had started, being a good salesman, Brian was on his way to meet another potential client when Tracy's cranberry-colored Mercedes-Benz pulled up 2 cars away from him in traffic around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Tracy worked mostly in the office, so Brian wondered if she had a doctor's appointment or something else she'd forgotten to tell him about. But just as he thought about it, Tracy drove past her doctor's office, and Brian knew her dentist was in the opposite direction. He decided to follow her for a bit and then pull up behind her and jokingly pounce on her as she parked the car. But she didn't park the car until 10 minutes later. When she did, she was in the parking lot of the Days Inn. Brian, driving 2 cars behind her in the same lane, pulled in behind her, drove to the end of the parking lot, and waited. She pulled up next to a dark green BMW. And when Nick, her boss, got out of his car, Tracy got out of hers. They looked around quickly, furtively glanced at each other, and then kissed lightly. Brian almost fell out of the car. He stared intently at the couple walking through the door together, as if they had done it 100 times before. They were really good together, with her holding his left arm just above her elbow and him with a strong arm for her to lean on, in her 4-inch stilettos. Hell, she hadn't worn stilettos for Brian in doggone eternity, but they were available. Brian got out of the car and followed the couple at a safe distance. He watched as Nick checked them in and paid for the room with his credit card. They entered the elevator and left. Brian walked to the counter, looked at the registration book, and headed upstairs, taking the elevator to the 2nd floor. 20 minutes later, Brian heard the unmistakable sounds of loving people. Tears rolled from his eyes as he stepped away from the door and headed back downstairs. Now what, he thought to himself. Now that he was paying attention, Brian guessed what days Tracy had been seeing Nick. The thing was, on sex days, as Brian mentally called them, when he walked in the door, Tracy always had freshly brushed teeth and washed hair, and her perfume smelled a little stronger, as if she had just added a little fresh to cover something up. These days, he noticed Tracy wasn't as affectionate and usually sat a little farther away from Brian on the couch when they watched TV. He also noted that she never showed amorous feelings on such evenings. But the good thing was that at least she didn't give him leftovers, as far as he could tell. But of course, the bad thing was that what he saw was not a one-time affair. She was definitely having an affair. Brian contacted a friend who was a lawyer. Brian had no idea where to start on this journey, so he relied on his friend's expertise. "In the end, Brian, are you sure you want a divorce?" Stanley Martel asked. "I know you're hurting right now, but are you sure there isn't some way around a divorce if you still love her?" Maybe there's a way to reconcile. I still love her, Stan. You can't just stop loving someone like turning off a light, but she obviously doesn't love me anymore. How could she do this to me after 22 years? I can never stay married to her. That wound will never heal, and I will check on her every day. I can't live like this, even if I still love her. That's the answer I needed. Give me a couple of weeks, and then we'll talk about all the details. He said, just be calm. If you can't be loving, don't do anything stupid, so you don't give her any reason to slow things down. Brian decided to keep playing ignorant. He decided that any time she wanted to have sex, as long as he could determine that it wasn't wet leftovers, he would take advantage of the situation. It might not be as loving and tender as it had been, but Brian decided that he too could use his wife's body as if she were. Over the next month, Tracy noticed that Brian seemed distracted and a little aloof, but in the bedroom, he seemed more than enthusiastic, if not a bit gruff. More than once, she'd had to ask Brian to tone it down. Brian, for his part, felt even more alienated from Tracy every time he saw her having another encounter with her lover, and his anger grew. The more he thought about the fact that she was playing innocent while actually giving him the horns, a few more weeks passed. Tracy and Brian were sitting on the couch, Tracy watching TV and Brian reading an industry magazine. Suddenly, Brian sat down as if an epiphany had come over him. He turned to Tracy. Do you think Nick will ever cheat on his wife? Brian asked, quite seriously. Why are you worried about that? Tracy asked, eyes wide. Because it says here that most men who have affairs have worse health than faithful husbands, allegedly. Men who cheat have higher blood pressure, which not only can lead to more strokes and heart attacks, but, as doctors point out, constant stress leads to other health problems. Nick is 32 years old and in excellent health, Tracy replied. And besides, I can't imagine him cheating on his wife. I mean, she's adorable, and he has 3 small children. Brian marveled at how quickly Tracy had come around. Damn, she's good, he thought to himself. But I'm better still. I think maybe I should talk to him about raising the cost of his insurance. Brian said almost carelessly. Suit yourself, Tracy said, hoping that would be the end of the conversation. A week later, however, Nick called Tracy into his office and closed the door. What the hell is going on? He said to her in a half-whisper, half-mockingly, as the door was closed. Now this jackass wants me to double my insurance policy because I might cheat. My health will suffer and I'll die young. Is he out of his mind, or are you two trying to blackmail me? Tracy was shocked at what Nick had said. What is my husband doing? I don't know what to say, Tracy stammered. I thought he was just talking nonsense. I didn't tell him anything. Of course not. You didn't tell him you'd buy more insurance, did you? She asked. Yes, I did, Nick replied. I thought it might be some kind of test, and decided that discretion was the better part of valor. He's coming by next Monday for me to sign the papers and pick up another check. That evening, Tracy broached the subject of the extra insurance with Brian, trying not to give away her overly close relationship with Nick. Of course, Brian wasn't shy about admitting to Tracy that he truly believed Nick was having an affair and that the extra insurance would come in handy someday. Although she couldn't tell Brian that he was actually right, he never once showed that he thought Tracy was involved, so she didn't push him too hard. He better stay ignorant, she thought to herself. While Brian wasn't ignorant, he realized that this ploy could backfire and end up costing him dearly, but he had to admit that watching the couple squirm was amusing. Monday morning, he showed up with the paperwork for Nick to sign, and Nick handed him another check. Brian played the grinning goon once more as he gave Tracy another thumbs up as he walked away. For that kind of money, I expect a round-the-world trip, he muttered as he passed Tracy in the hallway. Tracy had been particularly wary of Brian for a couple of weeks, trying to figure out if he really suspected or knew anything. She'd come to the conclusion that he was just being his usual self, like the lovable dumbass she'd grown to love over the years. But when she thought of him that way, she felt guilty for sharing her love and her body with another man. Apparently, guilt wasn't enough because the following week, Nick met her on Thursday at the Comfort Inn for their weekly date night. Brian watched from the back parking lot as they drove up. Separately, after about 90 minutes, they also drove off separately, smacking each other on the lips again. It was so sweet. It was almost nauseating, Brian thought, clutching the steering wheel of his car with quiet rage. Tracy didn't notice Brian getting home about 15 minutes later than usual because she was totally fine after having sex with Nick. He had taken her around the world again, the second time in 3 weeks, and it had taken a little more effort on her part. Tracy became concerned when Nick didn't show up for work on Friday morning. She texted him on his phone, but got no response. 2.5 hours later, 2 police officers showed up to talk to Ron Masterson, the big boss of the company. After a few minutes of talking to the 2 officers behind closed doors, Ron called a quick meeting in the company conference room. It seemed Nick Alwine never made it home last night, and this morning. The police found his car on an embankment, resting on its crumpled hood. They surmised from tire tracks that Nick may have been crossed by a wild animal, and in an attempt to avoid hitting it, he drove off the road and overturned, falling onto the embankment. The accident resulted in his death. Tracy left the meeting in a daze, almost reflexively. She called Brian. "He's gone, Brian, he's gone," she mumbled into the phone. "I know," he answered quietly. Brian was sure the answer wouldn't be memorable for the next month. Tracy was immersed in her grief. Although she never said it, her grief had nothing to do with Nick. Brian knew exactly what the cause was. They had become roommates, almost literally 2 people living together with no connection. Brian had expected this, assuming that Tracy loved Nick. He knew that Tracy wouldn't have cheated on him for so long if it was just sex. About a month later, Brian returned home in a very good mood. Nick's life insurance company was completely satisfied that the accident Nick had been in was an accident and paid out the policy, the very policy Brian had insisted on. $2 million. At least he listened to me and took care of his family, Brian told Tracy, showing her the check he was about to hand her. Tracy nodded affirmatively, but Brian could see tears in her eyes. No, he thought to himself. Cheating lovers have nothing left except maybe guilt. Brian handed the check to Nick's wife and was gone for about an hour. When he returned, all he could talk about was how Nick's wife had cried and hugged him as he handed her the check. "This is definitely one of those days I'll remember for the rest of my life," he said. Tracy gave him a blank stare, turned, and walked out of the room. Brian followed Tracy into the family room. She was sitting on the couch, staring absent-mindedly at the big screen TV. "You really loved him, didn't you?" Brian said quietly. Tracy's mouth opened, but no sound came out of it. After a few seconds, she burst into tears. "How long have you known this?" she finally asked, pulling herself together. "A few months before, I sold Nick his first life insurance policy," Brian replied. "You already knew then. Why didn't you say anything? Why did you go along with this stupid farce and sell him the policy? Are you really that desperate to be Salesman of the Year, Jesus?" Tracy's voice was filled with venom. "I guess you like me playing the part of the dumb cuckold, so I thought I'd give you an Oscar-worthy performance." She saw him smirk, "So I know he liked it too. And then you both decided you were untouchable." Tracy looked puzzled. "So, what about the second policy?" "What was that?" she asked wearily. "It was really about me taking care of the family," Brian replied confidently. "That extra $1 million meant that we would never be in financial trouble again if we played our cards right. But you couldn't know about the accident," she commented. Brian saw her brain kick into full gear. "No, it was pure luck," he said with a nonchalant look. "Luck for the family, wasn't it? The remaining Alvin would secure their financial future and never have to experience the hardship and pain of a messy divorce." Tracy looked like a deer in headlights until Brian mentioned divorce. Then she came to her senses and met his eyes. "Are we going to have to endure the pain of a messy divorce?" she asked. "Oh yes," replied Brian carelessly. "The last few weeks have shown me that it was more than sex, at least for you. You were genuinely in love with this guy, and I was halfway out. How could you think otherwise? But I'll show some decency in Nick's memory. I won't tell the widow about your affair. She believes the sun, moon, and stars revolved around her husband, and I will not tarnish her memory." Tracy leaned back on the back of the couch with a blank expression on her face. "Don't worry, it's a no-fault state. You'll get half of everything. I'll have you in court in a few days." But then he added, "But answer me one question. What did I do wrong?" For the first time, Brian's face took on a pained expression. He tried to find the answer on Tracy's face, but she didn't take her eyes off the floor. It took about 10 seconds before Tracy looked up, and the same mask of pain appeared on her face as on Brian's. "You didn't do anything wrong. Wrong at all. That was the problem, she began. You're such a good guy. You've been a wonderful husband and father. And Nick, well, he was the antithesis. He was cocky. He was brash. He had a beautiful wife and 3 beautiful children. And he wanted more. He wanted me. And against my better judgment, I gave in. You were so attentive and loving. If I wasn't in the mood, you understood. He just took me even when I wasn't in the mood. And the love and the attention. Now that I look back, it was mostly one-sided. But he was a bad boy, and he showed me that I was still a sexy woman for a young guy. He wasn't better. He wasn't more. He was just different. And I guess I was hooked by that and his dynamic personality. You're an insurance agent, Brian, and I mean that in so many ways. Brian packed a bag with his belongings and toiletries for the night. He told Tracy that he would be moving the rest of his belongings out in a few days, and that she could stay in the house until it was sold as part of the divorce proceedings. Local police were at a loss, trying to explain the strangest coincidence the town has seen in probably the last 100 years. Tracy Titman's car veered off the road and crashed in almost the exact same spot where her boss had crashed a few months earlier, with the same result, death. Being the only person alive who knew about Tracy and her boss's affair, Brian was not going to divulge that information, apparently. However, Brian wasn't the only one who knew that Tracy was taking Nick's death hard. Several of her coworkers had told the cops when asked, so the cops and then the insurance company focused on the suicide. It took the police 3 months to complete their investigation, and the insurance company 6 months. In the end, there was a $2 million difference at stake because Brian had increased Tracy's policy to the same amount as Nick's shortly after he sold Nick the policy. It only took a bit of paperwork, Tracy's signature, and a blood test. Although Brian used some insurance nonsense and never told Tracy the real reason for the new forms and blood test, being a good grieving husband, he waited for the results of the investigation. He told everyone, publicly and privately, that he highly doubted his loving wife would have been capable of committing such a reckless act as suicide over the death of her boss, a man she barely knew outside of the office. The police and insurance investigator could find no evidence to the contrary. The couple had a good working relationship, but their personal paths apparently did not match. Investigators concluded there was no evidence to link the 2 men. Brian only smiled when the insurance investigator told him that, while handing him the check. And Brian did when the company's Salesman of the Year award. As the company president was presenting him with the award, he announced his retirement.